wonderful to be back out here again where I'm usually tasked with giving some historical context to us being out here. And today's actually an interesting day to be out on Lake George. And it doesn't take much imagination to be moving across these waterways and be thinking about the past, because in so many ways this place is unchanged from what it was 250 years ago. And 250 years ago today, in fact 250 years ago this evening, headed in the opposite direction down Lake George, is General Philip Schuyler with one of his aides, who late that night will land at the landing at the northern end of Lake George at Ticonderoga, and the following day, July 18th, 1775, will formally walk into and take command at Fort Ticonderoga, barely a month after moving from the lowly position of New York's representative to the Second Continental Congress to a major general of the new Continental Army, where he will be tasked with shaping up what had been for months prior to this kind of motley assemblage of New Englanders and New Yorkers, a handful of Canadians and others, trying to make some kind of show of force against the British in the northern theater of the Revolutionary War, just months into this conflict. A conflict that was not yet a war for independence, but a war for our rights as Englishmen, but which had already, in just those few months after Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, had transformed dramatically from a defensive campaign with the Massachusetts militiamen and minute companies pushing the British out of Concord and back into Boston. And less than a month later, the capture of Fort Ticonderoga by Benedict, Arnold, Ethan Allen, and the Green Mountain Boys in May 10th of 1775 transforms this conflict. No longer is this purely a defensive war. Now it is something bigger. What is set in motion is the war that will become a war for independence. And it's the expansion of this conflict right here along Lake George, and specifically at Ticonderoga, that prefigures the evolution of our war from this colonial rebellion into what becomes a war for independence. And what makes this moment all the more powerful, particularly with Philip Schuyler himself moving along these waterways, is that this was not their first war, nor was it even their first war in this place. Philip Schuyler had served in colonial forces during the French and Indian War. He had assisted with the movement of thousands of soldiers, of hundreds of boats, tons of supplies up and down Lake George to feed and supply and provision the armies moving along this corridor during the French and Indian War, when Lake George was a waterway, but for much of that war, a kind of very wet no man's land between the French at the northern end, Ticonderoga, Fort Ticonderoga, and the English at the southern end. And Schuyler was not the only one that had had this experience in the 7 Years' War, serving in this theater where they were returning to in the Revolution. He came to take command at Ticonderoga, to assume command from the Connecticut officer, Colonel Benjamin Hinman, who was there, who himself, 15 years earlier, had been just a captain in the Connecticut forces in the same campaigns that Schuyler had served in. Dozens of generals and even more regimental officers in the Continental Army had fought in the last war, and they were replaying some of these campaigns, but now with a much different set of stakes than they had under the British imperial regime. They are now facing the British, who they had served under, and seen their capacity to move men and materiel, making the challenge that they faced, knitting together this complicated little American force into something that could go toe-to-toe with the regulars of the British Army. And so Fort Ticonderoga, as an historic site today, combines these themes as well. We are taking the opportunity of the 250th anniversary, not only of the United States, but the grueling 8-year-long civil war that it took to form the United States. Neither is the beginning nor the end of our mission to educate and to preserve and to tell a richer story about the early modern military experience and how it shaped the world that we still live with to this day. Because our story goes back centuries
the earliest moments of European settlement and the collision with native cultures here. It goes to the great imperial conflicts that would determine who would be in control of these waterways, and to the War of Independence that shapes the United States as a player in this field. But again, it doesn't end there. It continues into the later 18th and early 19th centuries as that independence is secured through later military campaigns. And that's what knits together these narratives, is the struggles that were involved to create a world, to create political boundaries that we still live with to this day. And so for us, this opportunity of America's 250th anniversary is a moment not just to wallow, to revel in this period, but to look backwards and forwards. And so for us, the revolution is not just the end of our goals. We go back to our history to drive inspiration from it, to move forward, to bring Fort Ticonderoga and our educational mission, using our incredible landscape and unparalleled historical resources and collections, to continue to do the work that we do into the 21st century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. It's just absolutely remarkable to be in such a significant place and see this landscape through your eyes and understand the past. And it's one thing to know the history, but it's another thing to engage our audiences. So we appreciate all you do, Matthew.